opening ceremony for our D-Day World War II event up front at the near the podium, near the museum side of the airplane. There'll be a flag raising. When that happens, we like you to stand, cover your hearts, and if you are active or foreign military, you can render the appropriate salute. Immediately following that, we're going to have a couple of presentations from the Navy and the Army on their participation in the D-Day event, the actual June 6, 1944 assault. And there'll be some more presentations later on. Plan on being around at 1 o'clock. That's when the weapons demo will occur right here. Various pistols and rifles, machine guns, etc. from both the Americans and the Germans will be demonstrated. So without further ado, we're going to raise the flag here in a minute. So at the time the flag goes up, please render the appropriate salutes and courtesies.
They said Cliff is going to do a quartet.
Is Rod singing the national anthem?
3 more people.
Yes, yes.
Whoa, we have a feet. Oh, wow.
I did. It's been 3 years.
She's saying during the ROTC.
Would everyone please stand and join me in singing our national anthem? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at our twilight's last gleaming, who drawn stripes and bright stars through the perilous night, for the ramparts we notched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Oh, don't cry, baby.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have our first presentation of the day. I'd like to introduce Keith Faulkner, who was in the Navy, and he is portraying Navy involvement in the D-Day operation. Maybe a few things you hadn't heard about in the past, but the Navy's contribution to our effort storming the beaches at Normandy. And now, Keith.
All right, Keith.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Keith.
First off, welcome. Thank you guys for coming out. I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, please visit the museum over here. This thing's fantastic. but this place is full of it. It's great. Okay, well, no sense in introducing myself because it just got done, so there you go. Second off would be my apology for a lack of expertise in this particular endeavor. What little expertise I do have lies in the South Pacific with guys like, Halsey and Nimitz, Spruitz, Fletcher, some of those boys out of the South Pacific. But on June 6th, at approximately 5:45 a.m., a child awoke in the north of France. He was awakened by the sound of thunder in the distance. What he thought was thunder was actually the beginning of the largest amphibious landing in history. There was over 6,000 ships involved, 6,000 vessels, over 1,000 of which were military combat vessels, 4,000 of which were the landing craft that got the boys to the beaches, and the remaining were support ships such as cargo ships and a lot of the support minesweepers. Is it up?
Yeah, it just went.
Oh. Well, so much for technology. That's a. We'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. All right. Again, I apologize for the notes, folks, but under the direction of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the overall commander of Operation Overlord, there was a subdivision of that. It was called Operation Neptune. That was the Navy's involvement in getting the boys from the ship, or actually from England, on the ships and into France. There was a fellow by the name of Bertram Ramsay. He was a British admiral, and he was appointed to this position simply because, well, has everybody ever heard of this guy? Bertram Ramsay? No? Well, has anybody ever heard of the evacuation of Dunkirk? All right, saved the British butt. Got them out of France. Well, Bertram Ramsay was the admiral in charge of that evacuation, along with the amphibious landings in 1942 of North Africa and 1943 in Italy. So he was well versed in amphibious landings. In any case, he was assigned to the landings at the now famous Juneau, Sword, Gold, Utah, and Omaha. The boys at Omaha actually got the worst of it. I don't know if anybody's ever studied their history, but Omaha Beach took the biggest beating when they tried to land.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
We're back.
Does it still work? Okay.
I can hear you.
Here you go.
I can
I'll
hear
stay
you
here.
now.
Hello.
I was
All
an
right.
electronic technician in the Navy.
Yeah.
He was the guy that did this, so he didn't have to speak.
I was the guy that broke things, so he had a job.
Yes,
Anyway.
exactly. Give it up for Clint. All right,
Yeah. Technical support. Well, there was a lieutenant commander, when they saw things going south in Omaha Beach, they realized what happened was, unfortunately, the bombardment, not only the naval bombardment, and as you'll discuss later, the aerial bombardment of these beaches in support of the naval landing went kind of awry because the shells went too far inland. They were overshooting the beaches. They were hitting some of the targets they were intended to, but most of the entrenchments in the beach were overshot. So when the boys landed, it was all there. Japanese, hello, again, South Pacific. The German positions were still up and running. Well, a lieutenant commander in charge of the destroyers saw this happen, and what he did was he ordered his destroyers in. Has anybody ever been to a nice pleasant day at the beach? You know where the wave just kind of rolls over, just starts to break? Well, just on the other side, the ocean side of that is where he put these destroyers. I mean, he was close. And what they did was they used those as actually floating artillery pieces to try and help these guys in. And between that and the Navy giving these boys a ride into the beaches, they got it done. There was a lot of loss of men, there was a lot of loss of personnel and materiel. One side note, which is kind of a weird thing about all the destroyers involved in this, were actually ended up having to be dry docked, not because of battle damage, because they got so close in that the sand rubbed the paint right off the bottom of these things, and they actually had dry dock about 8 of these things to get them just nothing more than just repainted, because they scrape all the paint off the bottom. In any case, I'm going to turn this over to one of those boys we gave a ride into. So from here it is. Here's Colin.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for showing up today. 77 years ago, our boys had one of the greatest fights of their life and possibly helped to turn the tide of the war. Does anybody know what the name of the operation was for the storming of the beaches of Normandy? Overlord. That's right, Operation Overlord. Do you know why it was called Operation Overlord? It was one of the greatest engagements done by all the Allies put together so far during that time. Now, the idea was to try and catch the Germans by surprise. Now, there was another operation involved as well called Operation Fortitude, and that was to direct their attention to the Pas de Calais, way further east than Normandy, so that way they would put the majority of their forces there, because that was also the shortest point between England and France in the canal. And thank God that it did work. They did put the majority of their forces there. Now, the main beach that I want to talk about today is Omaha. Everybody's heard of Omaha, right? And like Keith said, the main reason why it's talked about so much is because that was the hardest fight that our boys had. They were up against a crack division of the 352nd German Infantry Division, all veterans of the French invasion. So, and they were also a lot more of a greater staff than our intelligence had originally told us. So that, and plus they were also an entrenched army. They had already been there for a year. They had also put in fortifications along the beach, mines, you name it. They were definitely trying to break our backs at that point. Now, like Keith said, the Navy did the best they could, but because of the shellings, they were so far ahead, there was no chance of us finding any kind of cover once we hit that beach. So, just to take it back a little bit, at 1 o'clock in the morning is when we sent our airborne troops over, the 82nd and the 101st. Now, their job was to get behind the enemy lines and direct their attention further away from the original assault. And it did work, pretty much. You know, they sent their patrols out, and that was their main focus at the time. 3 hours later is when we started boarding our ships. An hour later is when the Navy started bombing the beach. And that was supposed to soften them up just so we could get on shore and start taking the positions that we needed to take. Now, the First Army, which consisted for Omaha Beach, was mostly the Big Red One. Everybody heard about that one? It's called that just because of the Big Red One on their patch. They were one of the most veteran units that were in the war at this time. They both had successes in North Africa and in Sicily. This is why General Omar Bradley chose them for the first wave. And supporting them was also the 29th Infantry of the Blue and Gray, who was actually a National Guard infantry from Virginia and Maryland. So at 1 o'clock, they sent the air troops over for 3 hours. Oh, there it goes again. Back on. Hello, hello? Okay. So for the next 3 hours, they were creating all kinds of havoc, just trying to draw as much attention away from the main landing force as they could. And they did their jobs. Well, finally, we get our troops loaded up around 4 o'clock in the morning. The Navy starts shelling the beach. An hour later, the first troops start hitting the beach, but they weren't troops. It was the 743rd Tank Battalion that finally made it to the beach. They were the first ones on. They were once again supposed to provide cover for our infantry guys. And the surprising part about this unit was they had the most surviving tanks ever to reach the beach. 40 out of 48 actually managed to make it to the beach. Unlike some of the other units where only 2, maybe 4, maybe 5 actually made it on. And it wasn't just from German fire. Sometimes they just couldn't make it. They would break down in the middle of the water. You know, the things that were keeping them buoyant just weren't working correctly. They would just sink, or just mechanical problems left and right. Well, thank God they made it there, because our first wave of units, of troops that actually made it to Omaha, they took a 3rd casualties immediately once they hit the beach. The second the Germans saw them, they just opened fire. Small arms, artillery, you name it. Everything was coming at our boys, and they just didn't know what to do. Even being the crack unit that they were, there was nothing but confusion. Does anybody know what the average lifespan of an infantryman was reaching one of those beaches? Can anybody take a guess? 30 seconds. You had 30 seconds to get off one of those ships and find yourself some cover before something happened. So, yeah, it was very brutal. Well, so for the next 2 hours, these boys are all alone out there, trying their best just to try and find cover and maybe at least try and put some fire on these enemy positions. and to no avail, unfortunately. It was pretty much a stalemate for the first 2 or 3 hours until the second wave could finally come in, but they were bogged down due to everything that was happening in the channel. So they were actually 2 hours late. Well, finally they make it ashore, and roughly around 9 o'clock is when our command staff starts showing up. They start taking control of the chaos, and they start pushing our boys forward. It wasn't until around 11:30, which is already 6 hours into the battle, where they finally start seeing some progress. They start pushing our boys forward, they start taking those bluffs, they start taking those pillboxes out, and we're finally starting to see some positivity on this beach. So roughly around 11:30 is when everything is finally taken care of. There's a few pockets of resistance here and there. They're trying to take out as best they can, and it wasn't until roughly around 9 o'clock that night as when we finally established a strong beachhead at Omaha. Now, does anybody know what the casualty rate was there? Anybody? We lost roughly between 2,000 to 5,000 troops just on that beach alone, which is more than all of the other 4 beaches combined. And that wasn't just killed in action, that was also wounded, some missing, things like that. But it was the largest amount of casualties in one day that we had sustained during that portion of the war. But thank God, up until 9 o'clock, even though we were still continuously being bombarded by enemy artillery that was around 8 miles back, we finally pushed in, established a strong beachhead. Our commanders were able to come ashore, take command of the situation, and push us on into Coville. And that was the first day of D-Day at Omaha Beach. Thank you.
All right, at this time, I'd like to call all the reenactors in uniform to gather on the museum side of the airplane. It's going to be a photo opportunity. We're going to take our event